Hello, my name is Joey Oickle, and I'm here to talk to you about the importance of creating a safe work environment. The topics I'm going to be talking to you about today is my personal experience with a workplace accident, industry regulations I didn't follow, ways I could have been compliant with OHS and ODR regulations, and the results of not following the OHS and ODR regulations. In early January 2012, I placed an internet job ad for divers to work in the seafood harvesting industry collecting sea urchins. Larry Collins replied to my ad and was hired. Larry provided me with a resume. On his resume, it indicated he was a commercial diver and he was a graduate of the Seneca Commercial Dive course. But it also showed that he had very little work experience in the commercial dive industry. Larry lived in Ottawa at the time and decided to move to Nova Scotia to work for me. February 15th, 2012, Larry moved here to Nova Scotia. I had decided to let Larry stay with me and my family to give him a start. On February 22nd, 2012, my crew and I were going out into the Bay of Fundy to collect sea urchins. We collected sea urchins by scuba diving. Each diver was equipped with a full set of gear. Each diver was equipped with a dry suit, a BCD, an air tank, regulators, dive computer, diver's alert, fins, and a weight belt. My crew and I left Westport Wharf on my fishing boat at 10:30 a.m. My crew consisted of myself, which I was to be boat captain, dive supervisor, Kyle Street, who was commercial diver, Dan McFarlane, who was commercial diver, Larry Collins, commercial diver, and Sean Street, who was to be dive tender and deckhand. We sailed into the Bay of Fundy to an area called the Northwest Ledge off Briar Island. Due to rough seas, I felt the dive conditions were unsafe to dive on the Northwest Ledge. I turned the boat around, sailed back to the Grand Passage between Briar Island and Long Island. While en route to the Grand Passage, I told my crew to get their scuba gear ready and to be ready to jump in the water as soon as we arrived. On our way, Kyle and I gave instructions to Larry, which was Larry was to follow Kyle to the bottom. Kyle would show him how to collect sea urchins, and once Larry was comfortable, he could then work alone in his own area. He was told to return to the surface if he got into trouble or felt uncomfortable. Once we reached the dive site in the Grand Passage, the three divers jumped into the water together. Larry descended quickly, followed by Kyle Street. Dan McFarlane had trouble descending due to buoyancy issues. When he finally reached the bottom depth of 65 feet, he couldn't locate either of the two divers. When Kyle reached bottom, he saw Larry and observed that Larry was having difficulty maintaining his position on bottom due to the strong currents. Kyle went over to Larry on bottom and began to show him how to collect sea urchins. A minute or so later, Kyle looked back and saw Larry floating farther away, but Larry wasn't showing any signs of distress. Kyle remained on bottom for about 18 minutes collecting sea urchins and moving with the currents. Kyle surfaced and was picked up by the boat. Dan McFarlane remained at the bottom for about 15 minutes, moving with the current. He decided to ascend to the surface. When Dan reached the surface, he couldn't see the boat. The area had become foggy with very little surface visibility. Dan blew the dive whistle, and I proceeded to pick him up. By this time, Larry had not yet surfaced. After picking up Dan McFarlane, I moved the boat back to the dive site where the divers entered the water. I immediately began to do a search on the surface for Larry. Even though I didn't hear his dive whistle, I was beginning to fear that something was wrong. Within 15 minutes of doing a surface search, I hailed a mayday to the Coast Guard using my VHF set. After I placed a mayday call, Carl performed a second dive from the location where he and the other divers first entered the water. Immediately, Carl found Larry's sea urchin bag on bottom, but could not locate Larry. Despite a search by us, by a number of other fishing boats, by the Coast Guard, by military personnel in a Cormorant helicopter for 2 days, Larry Collins could not be found. After 2 days, the search was called off. After 2 days, there was no reasonable expectations that he was going to be found alive. For another 3 days, volunteers with their boats continued the search on the surface, while volunteers scoured the shorelines looking for Larry's body. This is Larry Collins. The following days, my crew and I were interviewed by RCMP and were cleared of any criminal wrongdoing. Labor and Workforce Development had to do an investigation into what happened to Larry. Over the next year, my crew members and I gave multiple interviews to occupational health and safety officers. Within the first couple of days, I did provide a caution statement to OHS officers, in which I stated and believed I was aware of the occupational health and diving regulations, but found them confusing and did not know how they applied to sea urchin harvesting. I also knew an accident could happen, but I honestly never believed it could happen to me or my crew. So now I'm going to talk about the industry regulations I didn't follow. The worst part of not following the industry regulations is the loss of a great person. For me, his family, and his friends, there will always be so many unanswered questions. Because his body has never been found, the answers to those questions will never be known. For Larry, I made no inquiries to determine if Larry had a current certificate of medical fitness, which he did not, and this is contrary to sections 6, subsection 2, and section 12, subsection 1 of the ODR. There was no dive plan in place for February 22nd, dive contrary to section 20 of the ODR. I didn't mark the dive site at any time during the dive, contrary to section 29. No lifelines were used. None of the safety precautions required under section 49 subsection 1 of the ODR for scuba dives without lifelines were used. No audio communication system with the surface was used during the dive. Divers worked alone outside visual or physical contact with each other, i.e. the buddy system, as defined by section 49 subsection 1. No two-way voice communication system with the surface was used during the dive. Despite the current in the areas being more than 2 kilometers an hour, contrary to section 32 subsection 2. My crew did not maintain proper diver logbooks, contrary to sections 83 and 84, and I did not possess required knowledge and experience of a competent dive supervisor, as what is expected by the CSA Standard Incorporated. On the 23rd of March 2012, I was issued a stop work order. I could not organize or operate any dives until Department of Labor found my dive operation to meet all rules and regulations. Despite the stop work order, on October 26, I took it to dive team. I repeated all the same mistakes and still didn't create a safe work environment. This day could have led to someone being hurt again, but fortunately it was a day I was lucky. 3 divers entered the water together, but they separated on bottom to collect sea urchins. 2 of the 3 divers surfaced by the boat. The 3rd diver swam away from the vessel, and when he surfaced he was too far for anyone to see. The diver was so far away, no one could hear his air horn or see his lift bag. I immediately radioed the Coast Guard for assistance. Within 10 minutes, a Coast Guard cutter was on site. Within 30 minutes, the diver was located by the cutter. The diver had drifted 5 miles from the boat. The Coast Guard brought the diver back to my boat. The ways I could have been and should have been more compliant with OHS regulations. When hiring Larry or any new divers, instead of just looking at their certifications, I should have been looking at their practical work experience also. Also looking at their certification of medical fitness, which has to be done by a doctor who is certified to issue a medical fitness certificate for commercial divers. I should have made sure all equipment had been inspected by a certified professional, and the diver is familiar with all gear and equipment. Allow new divers easy entry level dives so a person can become used to the environment he or she is diving in. All divers have to have their own logbook and needs to be kept up to date. This allows everyone to view the work they've been doing in the past. A competent dive supervisor always needs to be present. This individual is responsible for the safety and duties of everyone working on the dive site. A dive supervisor logbook needs to be maintained on the job site. This records everything from weather, working conditions, and personnel working. This record keeping will allow any inspector to view exactly everything occurring on a work site. Marking the dive site with visible buoys, balloons, or flags, so the divers never leave that dive site and no vessels can never ever enter that dive site. Divers should always be tethered to a line connected to a buoy. This allows everyone on the surface to see exactly where the diver is. Having the divers work in groups or pairs in case of emergency, called the buddy system. Having communications with divers is the safest way to operate, either it be through hardwired communications or through wireless radio communications. Before each dive, there has to be clear instructions of safety protocols to the divers that include the conditions they'll be working in, staying in sight of each other, and not leaving the work site area. If these procedures had been implemented by me on my work site, February 22nd, 2012 could have turned out very differently. Larry could still be with us today. When Department of Labor gave me a written stop work order, I definitely should have followed their direction. They were in the process of trying to work with me to get myself and my company up to code. On the 20th of October, 2015, I pled guilty to my ODR in my Occupational Health and Safety Act infractions. I was convicted of sections 32, subsection 3 of the ODR regulations, which is each diver, ADS operator, or SEC attendant on the dive supervisor's dive team must be connected to the diving supervisor during a dive by a two-way communication system that meets the requirements of this section. A two-way communication system must be adequate and must allow two-way communication by voice or by pre-arranged communication signals on a lifeline or float. I was also convicted on sections 13 subsection 1, 55 subsection 4, 74 subsection 1 of the OHS Act. Section 13 subsection 1 states every employer shall take every precaution that is reasonable in the circumstances to provide such information, instruction, training, supervision, and facilities as are necessary to the health or safety of the employees. Section 55 subsection 4 states where an officer makes an order pursuant to subsection 1 and finds that the matter or thing referred to therein is a source of danger or a hazard to the health or safety of a person at the workplace, the officer may order that any place, device, equipment, machine, material, or thing not be used until the order is complied with. Work at the workplace or any part of the workplace stop until the order to stop work is withdrawn or cancelled. The workplace or any part of the workplace be cleared of persons and is isolated by barricades, fencing, or any means suitable to prevent access thereto until the danger or hazard is removed. In section 74, subsection 1, says a person who contravenes this act or the regulations, fails to comply with an order or direction made pursuant to this act or regulations, or a provision of a code of practice adopted pursuant to section 66, is guilty of an offense liable on summary conviction to a fine as set out in subsections 1A and 1B, or to a term of imprisonment not exceeding 2 years, or to both a fine and imprisonment. A person is liable to a fine of not more than $250,000, or a second or subsequent offense within 5 years from the date of conviction for previous offense, to a fine of not more than $500,000. Notwithstanding subsection 1A, where the offense resulted in fatality, the person is liable to a fine of not more than $500,000. My penalty for these infractions are a total of $62,150. The breakdown of my penalty is $41,000 in fines, $6,150 victim fine surcharge, $10,000 donation to the Public Education Trust Fund establishment by the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education, and $2,500 cost for publishing the safety advertisements, and $2,500 for travel costs for making safety presentations. Also, with my monetary fines, I must also complete 10 safety presentations. The safety presentations have to include the underlying facts and circumstances regarding the offense as set out in the agreed statement of facts with regards to these case numbers. Emphasis shall be placed on the regulations ignored, the result, which was the death of Mr. Collins, and what is to be learnt from this case, including the safety precautions necessary to ensure due diligence and to avoid similar incidents. Beyond my fines and presentations, the results of these events created by me has changed my life, my family's lives, my crewmates' lives, and the lives of Larry Collins' family. Larry's family will never be able to live with will only be able to live with the memory of him. They know they won't get to see him every day during special occasions or during holidays. My crewmates also had to live with the nightmare of that day. Even though they weren't at fault, they are and probably always will be troubled with the thoughts and feelings of what happened. What caused Larry to die? Could they have done more to prevent it? As for me and my family, our lives also instantly changed. We had to move, leaving our home. I suffered with extreme depression, still do. My family had to see me and our lives fall apart. Years of interviews and court proceedings. I have also shamed my name in an industry that I've been a part of for over 20 years. But I do realize and know I can restart and rebuild my life, but Larry will never get that chance. Thinking about all this, the day of his drowning, and about Larry will be something that I will think and have to live with forever. I cannot stress my final point enough. The rules and regulations are put in place for everyone's safety. No matter what industry you're working in, commercial diving or commercial fishing, don't be complacent, be competent, The most important thing at the end of a workday is being able to go home to be with your family and friends. Remember that someone is dependent on me and you to work safely today and every day. Thank you for listening to my presentation.